Okay. This amendment, which we're proposing, would seek to essentially not allow consideration for maritime area consent and consequently for any development consent at all. Three types of activities that we think there shouldn't be maritime area consents given for. Going in reverse order, actually, LNG, liquid natural gas infrastructure, we don't believe should get, of any description, should get maritime area consents, because we're supposed to be tackling climate change. We know we have to reduce fossil fuel use, and it runs counter to that to entertain the possibility of building new infrastructure to bring liquefied natural gas into this country. I mean, obviously, we still have a reliance on gas and so on, but to build new infrastructure to import liquefied natural gas would run counter to the stated commitment of the government and indeed all parties to reduce fossil fuel use and combat climate change. So we think they should simply not be considered for maritime area consents. Similarly, anything to do with the extraction of fossil fuels should not be considered. I mean, one of the issues that concerned my community over recent years was a move by Providence, I think it was, Providence Resources to try and drill for gas and oil very, very close to on the Kish Bank, indeed, which is only 6 to 10 kilometres from the shore. So there was huge potential concerns at many, many levels about that. But, you know, obviously sort of local environmental concerns and community concerns, but also the big issue of why we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and that we shouldn't be in any way facilitating the further exploration or extraction of fossil fuels which damage the environment. So we don't believe any such development should be considered for maritime area consents. And finally, maybe more controversially, but we do believe it's in line with practice in the rest of Europe, is to not consider major industrial offshore wind development closer than 12 nautical miles, the traditional foreshore distance, on the grounds that that is the general pattern across Europe, is to move these big industrial wind farms off to a reasonable distance from the coast. And that is undoubtedly the pattern, and the average distance for major industrial development of wind farms is, I think in Germany, I saw one document from the Ministry for Energy and Economics there was saying the distance is now average of about 53 kilometres. I read a document by the Crown, whatever they're called, I can't remember the exact name, but the body that represents the Crown, the British Crown. I have quite an interesting document about the development of offshore wind in the UK and their plans, and their base assumption for looking at the costs of developing offshore wind farms, their base assumption was that they would be developed 60 kilometres offshore. That was their sort of central scenario for looking at costs. Now that's interesting when you consider that the relevant projects that we are worried about are getting in under the wire of the marine protected areas that should be there and are planning, in the case of my area, Kish Bank, further down Wicklow, the Codling and so on, where we're talking about distances of only 6 to 10 kilometres on areas where they're going to have a huge, huge impact I mean, we're talking about things that are very significantly higher than the 2 pool bag stacks, and we're talking about 60 or 70 of those things, enormous, at that very, very close proximity, impacting on fishermen, impacting on a very sensitive, landscape, seascape, and so on, that is important at many levels for the community, for Dublin Bay generally, as a tourist amenity, and generally a precious marine environment. We think that we should be following best practice in Europe, which is to push that scale of industrial development further out, so that it doesn't have those negative impacts. I say that as somebody who believes we need to develop, as a matter of urgency, offshore renewable resources, but I think we need to have a buffer zone similar to the sort of distances that are now becoming the norm across Europe. I'm sure the Minister will say, oh, there are closer ones in other parts of Europe, but the general pattern is that they're being pushed further out, and as I said, the Crown document on this was using as a base assumption 10 times further out, 60 kilometres, than the sort of thing that is being entertained right along the east coast. So what we're looking for really in that sense is a win-win. We need offshore wind, but we also need to protect sensitive coastal environments and the communities and the people who make a living in those areas. And the marine biology and marine diversity and so on of those near-shore sites. So that's the logic of this amendment, and I'd be interested to hear what the Minister has to say in response.
This amendment effectively seeks to significantly restrict the scope of activities that can be considered for maritime area consent in a specific zone, and in so doing control development in the maritime area. It is important to remember that an MSC is merely a right to occupy a part of the maritime area, conditional on securing other necessary approvals. It is not a permission to undertake works, development or activities that is provided for under the Planning Act or in licensing, and is not a development control tool. The proposed amendment would unduly limit the potential of the maritime area to deliver renewable energy, and in so doing limit the state's ability to meet our climate action targets. The planning process is the appropriate place to determine the suitability of development in accordance with the objectives of the NMPF. And this goes for wind farms, mineral exploration or installations, or for the storage of gases or minerals. This amendment, it must be said, is very singular in its intent, but far-reaching in its impact. It treats all parts of the maritime area as one singular homogeneous entity and has little or no regard for local marine geomorphological conditions. The impacts of this amendment on the west coast in particular are of great concern, given the changes in ocean depth beyond 12 nautical miles in parts. And I am not convinced that any consideration has been given to the impact of this proposal on our renewable energy targets. The Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications is carrying out a review of the security of Ireland's energy supply, which is focusing on the period to 2030 in the context of ensuring a sustainable pathway to net zero emissions by 2050. And this review will consider how the government's increased ambition in renewable energy and the development of new indigenous clean energy sources will reduce fossil fuel energy use. So can the Deputy assure this House that this proposal will not negatively affect our ambitions in this regard? In terms of mining and mineral exploration, Chapter 17 of the National Marine Planning Framework points out that the future exploration and mining for scheduled minerals in the marine area is not anticipated at this point, and any potential activity in this area will depend on future exploration and mining technologies and national policy on mineral exploration and mining. Indeed, the Government's draft policy statement on mineral exploration and mining, published in July of this year, proposes that mineral exploration and mining activity does not take place offshore or on the Irish seabed until such a time as sufficient data is available to adequately assess the impacts of any such potential mining activity. So this is not an immediate concern. The NMPF also notes that security of energy supply cannot be examined in isolation from sustainability. Natural gas storage installations and activities could have potential adverse ecological and environmental impacts, which would need to be identified, analysed and mitigated against as part of the forward planning and development management stages of marine planning. In short, natural gas storage may be looked at in the round in the future during proper policy development, but we will not curtail options in this bill. I acknowledge that concerns raised by the deputies in this amendment. However, I do not consider that primary legislation should be used to control future development. The legislation provides for a robust planning system which will assess development in accordance with government policy and ensure that the environment is adequately protected. We use evidence to inform policy, and the policies inform the decision. Development control in primary legislation is simply not appropriate, particularly where it is aimed at frustrating the attainment of our energy security and climate action objectives, and as such I will not be accepting this amendment.
Yeah. Look, first of all, I mean, the Minister will be familiar, as will the officials, with the Marine Institute's real map of Ireland, but I don't know if the public are that familiar. And indeed, it begs the point, and I know you were saying that in the context of the marine planning framework there was public consultation done. But I can tell you from the public meeting we held in my area, the Save Our Seafront held, all of this was new to them. Right? So there's still a lot of people who haven't been reached about very, significant changes, plans and objectives and so on for the development of the marine area and how it may impact on them. So we still have a way to go in terms of the level of engagement with the public for them to fully understand the issues that are at stake, that we are discussing here. And that's not to diss the officials and whatever engagements they have had, but I think we have a long way to go yet. Okay? And one of the things the public need to know is about the real map of Ireland and the sheer size of Ireland's marine area. Okay? It's enormous. It is multiples of the size of the land of this country. So we have a huge, huge resource. And that means we have a lot of area to develop offshore wind. A lot. So I don't accept the Minister's suggestion that by having a buffer zone of minimum distance requirements from the coast, that this precludes us developing offshore wind. I just don't accept it. And I haven't heard a convincing, if any, response really from the government or the Minister as to why it is the case that increasingly in the rest of Europe they are pushing industrial offshore wind much greater distances out. And clearly, judging from that Crown document that I referred to, in terms of cost, the central scenario was 60 kilometres. In other words, they didn't see any major difference, I'll just finish on this, any major difference between 60 kilometres and closer in terms of the cost of developing. So there's no major cost implications of pushing the industrial wind farms a bit further out in order to have a win-win situation of getting our offshore wind and protecting our coastal environment.
Again, I suppose, just to address Deputy Boyd Barrett, I think that, right now the technology isn't there to put wind farms out where a deputy wants to see them. So I think that's the challenge that we have, and there's a significant drop-off in terms of depth on the east coast, and so currently they can only go out so far. I think the North Sea basin is very different from the Atlantic basin. Now, you mentioned Germany and other from the North Sea side of it. So I think that's the challenge that we have, and certainly I think floating turbines, as mentioned, we're not quite there yet in terms of the technology. It is going to take some time to do that, and I think, and again, accepting the points raised around mineral exploration. I suppose just to read quickly the government's draft policy statement on mineral exploration and mining, and just to give a bit of context. And it states that there has been no mining or little or no exploration of shedral minerals in Irish waters to date. future exploration and mining for scheduled minerals in our marine waters is not anticipated at this point in time. Concerns have been raised regarding the lack of research and data available to inform a comprehensive understanding of the potential impact of mining in the marine space. Discussion at EU level has referenced the need for better understanding the effects of deep seabed mining, and that is mining in areas of the seabed beyond national jurisdiction of the marine environment and its impact on biodiversity and human activities. It has been proposed that in advance of deep seabed mining taking place, it is important to ensure that risks are fully understood and the technologies and operational practices are able to demonstrate no serious harm to the environment, in line with the precautionary principle. Given the limited specific knowledge currently available, it is proposed that mineral exploration and mining activity does not take place offshore or on the Irish seabed until such a time as sufficient data is available to adequately assess the impacts of any such potential mining activity. And again, I think Deputy Gould mentioned frack gas, and there is a government policy that deals separately with, with this completely with this, which is a planning bill. Thanks.
Richard Boyd Barrett.
Yeah, look, first of all, Deputy Nash asked where did the threshold in terms of more than 5 turbines and a total output of more than 5 megawatts come from. It actually comes from Schedule 10 of the bill. So that's a threshold within the government's bill in terms of classes of development specified for the purposes of Chapter 3 of Part XX1. This gives you some idea of the complexity of this bill, cross-referencing with the Planning and Development Bill. Now listen, you raise interesting points, Minister, right? But I return to my original point is there's a lot of people who are going to be impacted by these things who have no clue what's going on, right? Now I consider myself somebody who keeps an eye on things, who's read into things, who knows a bit, and I don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, right? I don't quite know why they have floating wind off Scotland, for example, and you're telling us it's not really practical. I don't know. Maybe you know the answer. I don't. And I'd like to know. I'd like to know why they are moving industrial offshore wind further and further out in the rest of Europe. I'd like to know. I want to hear that debated. And I think the people deserve that to be debated. And there hasn't been a discussion. What I do know is that corporations that have self-selected sites, I repeat, they selected their own sites. We didn't plan them, we didn't designate them, wasn't done under any planning process. They selected the sites which are convenient for them, will be cheap for them, very profitable for them, and are going to have a big impact on our marine environment and communities. They selected the sites, right? So I want protection until this debate is had. And maybe you're right, and maybe you're not right. Okay, and I want that discussion had about sea depths and, you know, the engineering questions and so on. As I said, I read a lot, and I'm not convinced that there aren't reasons why in other parts of Europe they're pushing this stuff out.
Thank you, Deputy.
Okay, so that discussion has not been had, but the developers are moving ahead.
We're over time.
So that is what we're looking for in this, is some level of protection. And as for LNGs and fossil fuel extraction, that's a no-brainer. It shouldn't be happening, and there should be no sorry, I'll just finish on this. There should be no maritime area consents, because you can't do the development unless you get a MAC, if I'm right. So that's the point about starting at the MAC. If you don't get a MAC, you don't get the development.
I go back to previous points that were made. There is a rigorous system there of appropriate assessment, SEA, and within our planning system to, in the statement I made there, just in relation to the policy on mineral exploration, there's nothing scheduled to date. There's nothing, and I think everything is open to review, but is supported by a rigorous planning system. So I think to give assurance on that.